Do not open that drawer. Claire Bennett's voice crossed the dark house at 11:46 at night, calm enough that Robert Bennett froze with one hand somewhere inside her late husband's desk. Claire stood at the top of the staircase, barefoot on the cold hardwood, listening to the silence that followed. Less than 30 seconds earlier, the soft chime from the mudroom sensor had pulled her awake. One tone. Door opened. Then came the sound of shoes crossing the kitchen floor. No knocking. No voice calling from outside. Whoever had entered already believed he had permission to be there. Claire had reached for her phone before leaving the bedroom. Now she held it loosely at her side and watched the thin band of light spilling from Michael's home office into the hallway below. A drawer slid shut. Robert stepped into view. Her father-in-law wore a dark overcoat over a gray sweater, his silver hair damp from the November mist. He looked up at her without surprise. I knew you were awake. Claire glanced at the digital clock visible through her bedroom doorway. 11:47. How did you get into my house? Robert ignored the question. Come downstairs. We need to talk. Claire remained where she was. Outside, wind moved through the bare maple branches and brushed them against the siding. Inside, the refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. Every ordinary sound seemed sharper because one thing in the house was not ordinary. Robert was standing 15 feet from the mudroom door without having been invited inside. How did you get in? Claire asked again. Robert exhaled as though she were making a simple situation unnecessarily difficult. I still had a key. Something in Claire's expression changed, but her voice did not. You told me that key was lost. Robert looked toward Michael's office. It was only a glance, but Claire noticed it. She noticed everything now. His empty hands. The closed desk drawer. The distance between him and the exit. The fact that he had walked past a wallet on the kitchen counter and a laptop in the living room without touching either one. He had not come looking for valuables. He had come looking for something specific. I found it, Robert said. When? Does that matter? At midnight, inside my house, yes. Robert shook his head. This is exactly why I did not call first. You turn every conversation into an argument. Claire almost answered, then stopped herself. 3 months of grief had taught her that silence made certain people uncomfortable. Years in uniform had taught her something else. Discomfort often made people explain more than they intended. Robert looked back toward the office. There is something Michael left here. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her phone. What? A leather document case. For the first time that night, the cold in the hallway seemed to reach her. Claire knew the case. Michael had placed it in her hands weeks before his final hospital stay. Brown leather. Brass clasp. Scratched initials near one corner. He had given her one instruction about it, and Claire had followed that instruction exactly. Robert should not have known enough about the case to come searching for it. What do you think is inside? She asked. Documents that concern my family. I was Michael's family. Robert's jaw tightened. You know what I mean. Claire did. That was the problem. She had heard versions of that sentence ever since the funeral. Let me handle the paperwork. You should not make these decisions alone. There are things you would not understand right now. At first, she had mistaken those words for concern. Standing above him in the dark, she finally heard what had always been underneath them. Robert did not think grief had wounded her. He thought grief had made her manageable. He took one step toward the office. Claire's voice stopped him. Step away from that door. Robert looked up. Claire, Michael is gone. You do not need to make everything harder than it already is. She held his gaze. Leave my house. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave the smallest shake of his head, as though a widow setting a boundary were something almost childish. Claire looked down at the security notification glowing on her phone. Mudroom entry recorded. Camera active. 11:46 p.m. Robert believed he had entered the home of a woman who was alone, grieving, and easy to pressure. He had no idea that Claire had already started counting every choice he made from the moment the door opened. 3 months earlier, Robert Bennett had arrived at Claire's house carrying 2 cups of coffee and a black folder thick with paperwork. It was 4 days after Michael's funeral, and Claire had slept perhaps 12 hours in the entire week. Sympathy cards covered one end of the kitchen counter. A casserole from a neighbor sat untouched in the refrigerator. Michael's navy jacket still hung on a wooden peg beside the mudroom door because Claire could not yet decide whether moving it would feel practical or final. Robert placed one coffee in front of her and opened the folder. You should not have to deal with any of this right now. Claire looked at the pages. Insurance forms. Account information. Property records. Telephone numbers. Patricia Collins already gave me a list of what needs to be handled. Robert waved that away. And estate attorney handles paperwork. I am talking about family matters. At the time, Claire had heard concern. Robert had lost his son. She had lost her husband. Grief made everyone sound different. I appreciate it, she said, but I can manage the paperwork. Robert studied her for a moment. Claire, nobody expects you to manage everything. The sentence seemed kind enough then. 2 weeks later, he called asking whether Michael had kept old Bennett property records in his office. Claire told him she did not know. 3 days after that, he asked about a safe deposit box. Then came questions about Michael's computer, filing cabinet, and personal documents. Each request arrived wrapped in the same language. Let me help. You have enough to worry about. Michael always handled these things. By the second month, Robert stopped asking whether he could visit. He began announcing when he would arrive. One Tuesday afternoon, Claire returned from the grocery store and found him waiting in his car beside the driveway. I need 20 minutes in Michael's office, he said. For what? There are papers I need to check. Send Patricia a list. Robert stared at her. I do not need an attorney between me and my son's belongings. Claire set the grocery bags on the porch. You need my permission before going through my house. His expression changed. Not anger. Something quieter. Offense. As though the idea that Claire could deny him access had never occurred to him. You are taking this too personally. It is my home. That makes it personal. After that, Claire began keeping records. Dates. Calls. Messages. Unannounced visits. She did not call it evidence. She called it clarity. Years in military service had taught her that memory became unreliable when stress entered a situation, while a written timeline did not care how anyone felt about it later. Colonel Daniel Mercer called one evening and heard the exhaustion in her voice. Everything all right? Robert keeps asking about Michael's files. Do you want help? Claire leaned against the kitchen counter. No. I want him to respect the word no. Daniel was silent for a moment. Those are different things. Exactly. A week later, Claire remembered the spare key. Michael had given Robert 1 year earlier after a winter storm damaged part of the house while Claire and Michael were out of state. She sent Robert a message. Do you still have the spare key to the house? His answer arrived 19 minutes later. Lost it years ago. Claire stared at those 4 words longer than she expected. The next morning, she called a locksmith. The front door and rear patio door received new cylinders. Claire believed the mudroom lock had been included, but its older hardware required a separate replacement that never made it onto the final work order. She did not discover the mistake. Not then. Standing at the top of the staircase now, watching Robert inside her house at 11:49 at night, Claire understood exactly which door had been missed. You said you found the key, she called down. Robert looked up. Yes. When? Recently. Before or after I asked you to return it? He hesitated. Claire noticed. That is not important. It became important when you used it. Robert exhaled impatiently. I came here because you stopped listening to reason. Claire glanced at her phone. The security log continued counting forward. Robert still thought the problem was that she would not listen to him. Claire was beginning to see the real problem with perfect clarity. For 3 months, every offer of help had carried the same hidden assumption. Eventually, the grieving widow would surrender control. Tonight, Robert had stopped waiting for her to surrender it. Robert moved away from the foot of the stairs, but not toward the mudroom. Instead, he returned to the narrow hallway outside Michael's office and rested one hand against the doorframe. You keep talking about the key because you do not want to talk about why I am here. Claire stayed on the upper landing. You said you came for the leather case. I did. Then tell me why. Robert looked into the office. My father owned property outside Richmond years ago. There were questions about how it was transferred after he died. Michael kept copies of the records. And you believe they are in that case? I know they are. Claire studied him. Have you seen them? Robert hesitated. Michael and I discussed them. That was not my question. His patience thinned. This is not a deposition, Claire. Then give me a simple answer. Robert looked up at her. No. I have not seen what is inside. Claire let the silence remain between them. The leather case had been sitting in the bottom drawer of Michael's desk for months. She had never opened it. She could still remember the afternoon Michael gave it to her. He had been sitting at the kitchen table, tired enough that lifting his coffee seemed to require thought. He slid the worn brown case across the table and covered her hand with his. Keep this until Patricia is with you, he had said. Do not open it before then. Claire had asked what was inside. Michael gave her the faint smile she missed more than she could explain. Paperwork. Nothing you need tonight. She had respected the instruction because she trusted him, not because she understood it. Now Robert was standing inside her home demanding something neither of them had seen. Michael told me the case was to stay closed until Patricia Collins was present, Claire said. Robert gave a dismissive shake of his head. Michael was trying to protect you from details you did not need. While he was sick. Did he tell you that? I knew my son. So did I. The answer came quietly. Robert's eyes hardened. You were his wife for 9 years. I was his father for 42. Claire felt the sentence land, but she refused to carry the weight Robert intended to put inside it. Love was not measured in seniority. Grief did not become ownership because someone had known the dead longer. And none of that gives you permission to enter my house at midnight. Robert stepped into the living room. Claire adjusted her position slightly, keeping him in view while maintaining distance. On the console table below, a small brass challenge coin caught the hallway light. The worn edge was familiar even from upstairs. Colonel Daniel Mercer had handed it to her years earlier after an assignment that had tested every ounce of patience she possessed. She remembered the room, the exhausted voices, the pressure to decide before anyone had enough information. Daniel had leaned toward her and spoken quietly enough that only she could hear. Never borrow someone else's panic. Claire had carried those words longer than the coin. She looked back at Robert. His urgency belonged to him. His frustration belonged to him. His belief that everything had to be resolved tonight belonged to him. She did not have to accept any of it. The case stays closed, she said. Tomorrow I will call Patricia. Tomorrow could be too late. For what? Robert stopped. Claire saw the answer disappear behind his expression before he could speak it. That is what I thought, she said. He frowned. You think being calm makes you right? No. I think facts will tell us what is right. Robert looked toward the office again. You have no idea what you are dealing with. Claire glanced at the security notification still glowing on her phone. Entry recorded. Camera active. Every minute preserved. Maybe not, she said. But I know exactly what I am dealing with tonight. You entered without permission, you went directly to Michael's office, and you are refusing to leave because you want something you cannot prove belongs to you. Robert stared at her. For the first time, his expression changed from impatience to uncertainty. Claire understood why. He had expected grief to make her easier to rush. Instead, every minute he remained inside the house gave her more time to understand him. The clock on Claire's phone changed to 11:53. Robert remained in the living room, caught between the office behind him and the mudroom door 20 feet away. You are treating me like a stranger, he said. A stranger would not know which drawer to open. Robert looked toward the office, then back at her. I told you why I came. You told me what you want. Those are different things. He rubbed one hand across his forehead. Michael should have given those records to me months ago. Maybe he had a reason not to. Or maybe he was sick and trying to keep you from worrying about problems you could not solve. Claire felt the old pressure beneath the words. Robert had been doing this since the funeral, taking every decision Michael made and translating it into proof that Claire needed someone else to think for her. Tomorrow Patricia can tell us what the documents mean. I am not discussing Bennett family property with your attorney. She was Michael's attorney. Robert's expression tightened. You always have an answer. Claire looked at the challenge coin on the console table below. Its brass edge caught another thin stripe of light. For an instant, the house disappeared. She remembered a conference room years earlier, rain ticking against narrow windows while exhausted officers talked over one another. A deadline had been closing in. Everyone wanted a decision immediately. Colonel Daniel Mercer had placed that same coin beside Claire's notebook and said, "Never borrow someone else's panic." Claire had slowed the room down long enough for facts to replace urgency. She understood now that Robert was trying to create the same pressure. Midnight. Grief. Michael's name. Family loyalty. Every piece designed to make waiting feel irresponsible. Claire returned to the present. "I am asking you one final time to leave." Robert stared at her. "And I am asking you to stop acting like you can handle everything because you wore a uniform." Claire said nothing. He continued, mistaking silence for an opening. "Michael is gone. You are alone in this house. There is an estate you barely understand, property questions you know nothing about, and people trying to help you. At some point you have to admit you cannot do all of this by yourself." The words settled through the hallway. Claire descended one stair, then stopped. "You keep confusing being alone with being helpless." Robert's face changed. "Not much. Just enough." Claire lifted her phone. "I do not need to understand every document tonight. I need to understand what is happening in my home." She opened the security application. The mudroom sensor recorded your entry at 11:46. The hallway camera recorded you walking directly to Michael's office. "I still have the message where you told me the spare key was lost." Robert glanced toward the small camera above the hallway. He had not noticed it before. "You recorded me?" "The security system recorded an entry into my house." "You knew I might come here." "I knew you had stopped respecting boundaries." Robert gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "So this was some kind of trap?" "No. You were never invited to come." Claire tapped the call screen she had prepared while he was speaking. "You can leave now." Robert looked toward the mudroom but did not move. "Or what?" Claire held his gaze. "Or I ask the sheriff's office to help you understand that no is a complete answer." He seemed almost offended by the calmness of it. "You would call law enforcement on Michael's father?" "I would call because someone entered my home without permission and refused to leave." Robert shook his head. "This is a family matter." Claire selected the number. When the dispatcher answered, she gave her full name, her address, and only the facts. An unauthorized person had entered using an old key. He had been asked to leave. He was still inside. No shouting. No exaggeration. No attempt to make Robert sound worse than his own choices already did. When she ended the call, the house became quiet again. Robert stared at her as though he were seeing something that had been there for years, but had never interested him enough to notice. Claire had not raised her voice. She had not threatened him. She had not touched the leather case. She had simply refused to let his urgency become her command. Outside, November wind moved across the porch. Inside, the security clock continued counting. Robert had entered believing the widow upstairs would eventually surrender because she was alone. At 11:56, he finally began to understand that being alone had never been the same thing as being unprepared. The dispatcher had barely ended the call when Robert's expression shifted from disbelief to irritation. "You really did it." Claire remained on the staircase. "I asked you to leave. You called the sheriff over paperwork." "I called because you entered my home without permission and stayed after I told you to go." Robert looked toward the mudroom again. He could have walked out. Claire knew that. He knew it too. Yet something kept him rooted there, some stubborn need to prove that family history gave him authority inside a house that was not his. "You are going to regret turning this into something official," he said. Claire almost smiled at the word official. For years, official had meant orders, reports, timelines, signatures, and facts that remained facts regardless of who disliked them. "It became official when you used a key you told me was lost." Robert crossed his arms. "I found the key in an old toolbox." "When?" "Last week." "And you decided not to tell me?" "Because I knew you would demand it back." Claire let the admission sit untouched. Robert seemed to realize what he had said only after the silence returned. "That is not what I meant. I did not interpret it. I listened." The security application vibrated with an update. A deputy had been dispatched. Claire checked the time. 11:58. She remained where she could see the hallway, office entrance, and mudroom without moving closer to Robert. He looked at her phone. How long? Long enough. Claire, think about what you are doing. Once someone writes this down, you cannot pretend it never happened. I have no intention of pretending it never happened. Robert paced several steps toward the living room window and stopped. Michael would hate this. The words struck the place in Claire. That still expected to hear her husband's key in the front door every evening. For 3 months, Robert had used Michael's memory whenever ordinary persuasion failed. Michael would have wanted me involved. Michael trusted me. Michael would never shut his father out. Tonight, Claire finally understood why those sentences had always left her exhausted. Robert was not remembering Michael. He was borrowing Michael's voice. Do not use my husband to make your choices sound like his, she said. Robert stared at her. He was my son. And he was my husband. Neither relationship gives you permission to speak for him now. The wind pushed a branch against the siding with a dry scrape. Robert's gaze drifted toward Michael's office. There are things in that case that could affect people besides you. Then Patricia can review them. You trust an attorney more than family? I trust the process Michael asked me to follow. Robert shook his head. You always were stubborn. Claire looked toward the brass challenge coin below. Daniel Mercer had once told her that discipline was easiest to admire when nothing tested it. The real measure came when someone knew exactly which emotion to provoke and tried to make you act from it. Robert had tried grief, guilt, urgency, family loyalty. Now he was trying Michael. Claire refused to give him any of them. Headlights moved across the front curtains and disappeared. Robert turned toward the window. A second later, another wash of white light crossed the room and stopped. The low sound of an engine settled outside. Robert's shoulders stiffened. You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. Claire descended one step. Was it? He did not answer. Did you accidentally use the key? Silence. Did you accidentally walk into Michael's office? Robert looked away. Did you accidentally stay after I told you to leave? The doorbell rang. Robert stared toward the foyer. For the first time since Claire had seen him standing beside Michael's desk, he looked uncertain. Claire walked down the remaining stairs without rushing, stopping several feet from him before turning toward the front door. Stay there. Robert opened his mouth, then closed. Outside, measured footsteps crossed the porch. A calm woman's voice followed. Sheriff's office. Claire looked at Robert once more. He had entered expecting a grieving widow he could pressure until she gave him what he wanted. Instead, every excuse he had offered had become another fact he would now have to explain to someone who had no reason to mistake entitlement for family concern. Claire opened the front door to a woman in a dark sheriff's uniform standing beneath the porch light. Cold November air slipped into the foyer. Mrs. Bennett? Yes. Deputy Allison Grant. Dispatch said someone entered your residence without permission and is refusing to leave. Claire stepped aside enough for Allison to see Robert near the living room. That is my father-in-law, Robert Bennett. He used an old spare key to enter through the mudroom. I did not give him permission to come inside tonight. I asked him to leave, and he refused. Allison looked toward Robert. Sir, do you live at this address? Robert gave a tired shake of his head. No, but this is being made into something it is not. My son lived here. We are dealing with family documents. Allison's voice remained even. Were you invited here tonight? Robert hesitated. Not exactly. Did Mrs. Bennett know you were coming? No. Did she ask you to leave? Robert glanced at Claire. She did, but there is context. Allison took out a small notebook. You can explain the context. First, I need the basic facts. Claire recognized the rhythm immediately. Separate what happened from what people wanted it to mean. Robert seemed less comfortable with that distinction. I had a key, he said. How did you get the key? Allison asked. My son gave it to me years ago. Did Mrs. Bennett know you still had it? Silence stretched for a second. She thought I lost it. Claire unlocked her phone. I have the message. Robert looked at her. Of course you do. Claire did not respond to the tone. She opened the conversation and handed the phone to Allison. The message was still there, plain and uncomplicated. Claire asking whether Robert had the spare key. Robert answering that he had lost it years ago. Allison read it and returned the phone. When did you find the key? Last week. Did you tell her? No. Why not? Robert exhaled. Because she would have asked for it back. Allison paused before writing that down. The scratch of her pen sounded unusually loud in the quiet foyer. Robert looked toward Claire as if expecting her to react. She did not. He had supplied the fact himself. Allison asked, "What did you do after entering?" "I went in my son's office." "Why?" "There is a document case in there involving Bennett family property." "Does the case belong to you?" Robert's jaw tightened. "It contains records that concern me." "That was not my question." Claire almost heard Daniel Mercer's voice in the deputy's calm precision. "Facts first. Urgency later." Robert glanced toward the office. "I do not know who legally owns the documents." Allison nodded. "All right. Mrs. Bennett, do you have security footage of the entry?" Claire opened the application. The mudroom sensor recorded the door opening at 11:46. The hallway camera shows him walking toward the office. She showed Allison the timestamp and saved clip. Robert stared at the screen. "You have cameras inside now?" "In the entry hallway." "Since when?" "Since unannounced visits became a pattern." His expression hardened. "So you have been building a case against me?" Claire met his eyes. "No. I have been keeping a record of what happened." Allison returned her attention to Robert. "Mr. Bennett, whatever disagreement exists about those documents can be handled through the estate attorney. Mrs. Bennett has made clear that you do not have permission to remain in the residence tonight. You need to leave." Robert looked stunned by how ordinary the words sounded. No accusation. No humiliation. Just a boundary stated by someone he could not dismiss as an emotional widow. "This is ridiculous," he said. "My son would never have wanted this." Claire felt Michael's name reach for the same wound again, but this time it found no opening. "Michael left instructions," she said. "I am following them." Robert looked from Claire to Allison, then toward the office one final time. "You do not even know what is in that case." "That is exactly why I am not opening it without Patricia." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Robert reached into his coat pocket and removed a small brass key. He placed it on the entry table. The sound was barely more than a tap. Claire looked at it without moving. 3 months earlier, Robert had claimed that key no longer existed. Tonight, under the steady porch light and the quiet attention of a third witness, the truth had finally become something he could no longer redefine. Robert left the brass key on the entry table, but his hand remained beside it for a moment, as though surrendering the object required more effort than admitting how he had used it. Deputy Allison Grant waited without rushing him. Finally, Robert stepped back and reached for his coat. "I suppose that settles everything," he said. Claire stood near the staircase. "It settles tonight." Robert gave her a long look. "You always did know how to make a point. I asked you to leave before anyone else was involved." Allison closed her notebook. "Mr. Bennett, any disagreement involving estate documents needs to be handled through the appropriate legal process. Do not return to this property without Mrs. Bennett's permission." Robert nodded once, but his attention remained on Claire. "When you open that case, you're going to understand why I came." Claire did not answer. Allison opened the front door, and cold air rolled across the hardwood floor. Robert stepped onto the porch. Before leaving, he looked back toward Michael's office, then disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch light. Allison remained long enough to confirm Claire's contact information and explain that the incident had been documented. When the deputy finally left, Claire locked the front door and stood in the silent foyer. The brass key still rested on the table. She picked it up, feeling its worn teeth against her palm. Such a small object had carried an enormous assumption that access once granted could never truly be withdrawn. Claire set it beside the challenge coin. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Mercer had replied to the message she had sent shortly after contacting the sheriff. "I am nearby. Do you need me?" Claire typed. "Back, come by if you are awake. I could use coffee." 20 minutes later, headlights crossed the front windows. Daniel arrived carrying 2 paper cups and wearing an old field jacket over a gray sweatshirt. Claire opened the door before he could knock twice. His eyes moved briefly from her face to the brass key on the table and then toward the hallway. "You all right?" "I am." He handed her a cup. "Then I will believe you." That was one reason Claire had trusted him for years. Daniel never confused support with taking command. They sat at the kitchen table while Claire explained what had happened. He listened without interrupting until she mentioned the leather case. "You still have it?" he asked. "Yes." "And Michael told you not to open it without the attorney?" "Exactly." Daniel took a slow drink of coffee. "Then you already know what happens next." Claire nodded. "I call Patricia in the morning." Daniel glanced toward Michael's jacket hanging beside the mudroom. "Robert knows what he thinks is inside. That does not mean he knows what is inside. He believes the records concern property his father owned outside Richmond. Belief and documentation are not the same thing." Claire looked at him. "You sound like me. You learned from excellent people." A faint smile crossed her face. The house felt different now. Not safer because Daniel was sitting in it, and not safer because a deputy had come. It felt safer because uncertainty had finally narrowed into a sequence of facts. Robert had possessed the key. He had concealed that fact. He had entered without permission. He had gone directly to Michael's office. He had demanded a case he admitted he had never opened. Everything else could wait for daylight. At 12:41 in the morning, Claire called Patricia's office and left a short voicemail requesting a meeting as soon as practical. She mentioned the document case, but nothing more. Afterward, Daniel stood to leave. "You sure?" he asked. Claire understood the question. "Yes." He nodded. No lecture. No insistence that she should not stay alone. At the door, he paused beside the challenge coin and the returned key. "Funny thing about boundaries," he said. "People who respect them rarely need them explained twice." Claire looked at the two objects under the foyer light. "And people who do not?" Daniel opened the door. "Eventually they explain themselves." After he left, Claire returned to Michael's office. She did not open the leather case. She did not even touch the clasp. She simply stood beside the desk and remembered the last instruction her husband had given her about it. Wait for Patricia. Claire had spent the night refusing to let Robert's urgency become her command. Now she would do the harder thing. She would wait, because whatever truth was inside that case deserved daylight, witnesses, and no one else's pressure. 2 mornings later, the leather document case sat unopened on the polished conference table in Patricia Collins's office. Claire sat on one side with Daniel Mercer beside her, while Robert occupied the chair across from them. Morning light filtered through tall windows overlooking a quiet Virginia street, catching the scratches on the case's brown leather and the tarnished edges of its brass clasp. Patricia placed a folder beside it. "Before we open this, I want the record clear." Michael instructed that these materials remain sealed until Claire and I reviewed them together. Robert leaned forward. "Michael told me those records concerned my father's property." Patricia looked at him. "They do concern property once owned by your father. That does not mean the records belong to you, and it does not give you authority over Michael's estate." Robert glanced at Claire. "You knew that." "I knew Michael wanted Patricia present. Nothing more." "You expect me to believe you never looked?" "Yes." The simplicity of her answer seemed to unsettle him. Patricia released the clasp. Inside were several envelopes, copies of deeds, tax records, correspondence, and a sealed white envelope bearing Claire's name in Michael's handwriting. Claire stopped breathing for half a second. She knew every angle of those letters. She had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, grocery lists, notes beside the coffee maker, and the last anniversary card she still kept in her nightstand. Patricia reviewed the property documents first. Years earlier, Robert's father had transferred his interest in a small parcel outside Richmond through a properly recorded agreement. Michael had kept copies because Robert had repeatedly questioned details of the transaction. The documents did not reveal a hidden inheritance. They did not establish secret ownership. Most importantly, they gave Robert no right to remove anything from Claire's home. Patricia placed the final record on the table. "There is no emergency here, Robert. If you had contacted me, I could have explained this." Robert stared at the papers. "Michael knew I disagreed with that transfer." "Yes," Patricia said. The correspondence makes that clear. Then why keep all of this from me? He did not keep the transaction from you. He kept copies of the records. Robert's shoulders lowered slightly. For months, he had treated the case as though whoever possessed it controlled the truth. Now the truth sat beneath ordinary morning light, reduced to dates, signatures, and documents that had never needed a midnight search. Patricia slid the sealed envelope toward Claire. This is personal. You may read it privately. Claire rested her fingertips on the paper. I want to read it here. She opened the envelope carefully. Michael's letter began with the house. He reminded her about the maple tree that needed trimming and the porch light he had promised to replace. Claire smiled despite herself. Then the words changed. Michael wrote that after he was gone, people would want to help her. Some would help because they loved her. Others might help because they believed grief had made her easier to manage. He asked her to know the difference. Claire's eyes remained on the page. Michael wrote that he had never admired her because she was fearless. He admired her because she could be tired, uncertain, grieving, or afraid and still refuse to let pressure make decisions for her. Then came the sentence that made the room completely still. Do not let my absence become anyone else's permission to take your choices away from you. Claire lowered the letter. Robert was staring at the table. After several seconds, he asked quietly, Did he write that because of me? Claire studied him. There was no triumph in her expression. He did not name you. Robert looked away. Daniel had remained silent through the entire meeting. Now he spoke without raising his voice. Maybe you should think about why it felt like he did. No one added anything. No one needed to. Robert had entered Claire's home believing the leather case contained something powerful enough to justify crossing her boundary. It did. Just not the kind of power he expected. The most important thing Michael had left inside was not control over property. It was a reminder that Claire had never needed another person to decide what she was capable of. 3 days later, Claire stood beside the mudroom door while a locksmith tested the new cylinder for the second time. Morning sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, pale and clean, touching the wooden peg where Michael's navy jacket still hung. The locksmith turned the key, checked the deadbolt, then handed Claire 2 fresh copies. That takes care of the last old lock. Claire closed her fingers around the keys. Good. Thank you. After his truck disappeared down the driveway, she stayed beside the door for a while. The house was quiet, but it no longer carried the same tension. Robert had not called since the meeting at Patricia's office. Patricia had sent written instructions that all future questions concerning Michael's estate or the Bennett property records were to go through her. Claire had added one boundary of her own. Robert was not to enter the property without her express permission. There had been no dramatic punishment. No public humiliation. No moment when Claire needed to watch him lose everything in order to feel that justice had been done. Robert had simply lost the privilege he had mistaken for a right. Near noon, the doorbell rang. Daniel Mercer stood on the porch holding 2 coffees and a small paper bag. Claire opened the door. You are becoming predictable. That happens with age. You said that 10 years ago. Then I have been consistent. Claire smiled and let him inside. They ate sandwiches at the kitchen table without discussing Robert for several minutes. Daniel never treated silence as something that needed fixing. Eventually his eyes moved toward Michael's letter resting beside the leather case. How many times? He asked. Claire knew what he meant. 5. Any easier? Different. She looked toward Michael's jacket. The first time, it felt like losing him again. The last time, it felt like he was reminding me who I was before everything became hospitals, paperwork, and condolences. Daniel nodded. Sounds like Michael. Claire traced one finger along the rim of her coffee cup. I kept wondering whether setting boundaries with Robert meant I was shutting out Michael's family. And now? Now I think Robert was asking me to prove I respected the family by ignoring my own judgment. Daniel leaned back. Those are not the same thing. No. Claire looked at him. They never were. Daniel left an hour later after accepting her answer that she was fine without asking it twice. That afternoon, Claire carried the leather case into Michael's office. The property documents had remained with Patricia, but Michael's letter belonged here. Claire opened the top desk drawer and placed the envelope inside. Then she retrieved Daniel's worn challenge coin from the foyer and set it beside the letter. Two small objects from two different chapters of her life. One reminded her of the officer she had learned to become. The other reminded her that Michael had seen that strength long after the uniform came off. Claire closed the drawer. She did not pack away Michael's photographs. She did not remove his books. She did not force herself to make decisions simply because other people believed healing should have a schedule. Grief could remain without being given command. Evening came early. The windows darkened, and wind moved through the maple branches outside. Claire turned off the office lamp and walked through the kitchen toward the mudroom. Michael's jacket hung where it had hung every day since the funeral. She touched the sleeve gently, then reached for the new lock. 3 nights earlier, the sound of this door opening had carried someone else's assumption into her home. Robert had believed widowhood had made her uncertain, and uncertainty had made her weak. He had been wrong about both. Claire turned the deadbolt. Click. The sound was small enough to disappear beneath the hum of the refrigerator, but she stood there listening to it anyway. No applause followed. No one witnessed it. That was fitting. The strongest boundaries in Claire's life had never needed an audience. She switched off the kitchen light and walked upstairs while the house settled quietly around her. Being alone had never made her helpless. It had only made the boundary hers to draw.